Welcome to STEM Talk.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Welcome to STEM Talk, where we introduce you to fascinating people who passionately inhabit the scientific and technical frontiers of our society.
Hello, I'm your host today, Dr. Morley Stone, stepping in for STEM Talk's regular co-host, Dr. Dawn Kernagas. Joining me to introduce today's podcast is the man behind the curtain, Dr. Ken Ford, IHMC's director and chairman of the Double Secret Selection Committee that selects all the guests who appear on STEM Talk.
Hi, Morley. It's great to be here. Our guest today is our friend Dr. Josh Hagen, director of the Human Performance Collaborative and an associate research professor in the Department of Integrated Systems Engineering at Ohio State University.
Launched in 2019, the Human Performance Collaborative brings together a multi-disciplinary team of researchers, sports scientists, data scientists, and practitioners with the unified goal of optimizing human performance in athletes, military troops, and patient populations. Within the human performance research area, Josh leads two areas: sport and tactical performance science and recovery science. At Ohio State, Josh works with other performance science researchers to evaluate the physical traits and capabilities of athletes. Josh and his colleagues then work with coaches and athletic trainers to make adjustments that the athlete should enact in the weight room, on the field, or during recovery after training or competitions. Josh is a graduate of the University of Cincinnati, where he studied bio-inspired photoelectronic devices and earned a PhD in material science and engineering. He spent 11 years at the Air Force Research Laboratory, which is where I got to know Josh. And after his stint at the Air Force Research Lab, Josh headed to West Virginia University as a director of the Human Performance Innovation Center at the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute. In addition to his current position at Ohio State, Josh also has a collaborative role at IHMC as a senior research scientist.
Before we get to our interview with Josh, we have some housekeeping to take care of. First, we really appreciate all of you who have subscribed to STEM Talk, and we are especially appreciative of all the wonderful 5-star reviews.
As always, the Double Secret Selection Committee has been continually and carefully reviewing iTunes, Google, Stitcher, and other podcast apps for the wittiest and most lavishly praise-filled reviews to read on STEM Talk. If you hear your review read on STEM Talk, just contact us at stemtalk@ihmc.us to claim your official STEM Talk t-shirt.
Today, our winning review was posted by STEM Talk listener Elizabeth Ann. The review is titled, Important Concepts Explained Perfectly. It reads, the hosts of and the team behind STEM Talk do an incredible job at picking relevant topics and then explaining those complex topics thoroughly. As a college student studying communications, I love knowing I can always turn to STEM Talk for some exciting, but most importantly accessible science info. Here's to many more awesome episodes.
Thank you, Elizabeth Ann, and thanks to all our other STEM Talk listeners who have helped STEM Talk become such a great success.
Okay, and now on to today's interview with Dr. Josh Hagen.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
Hello, this is Morley Stone, your co-host for this episode. Joining us today is Josh Hagen. Josh, welcome to STEM Talk.
Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Also joining us is Ken Ford.
Hello, Morley, and hello, Josh.
Hey, Ken.
So, Josh, you grew up in Chillicothe, Ohio, a small town tucked into the southern part of the state. Since you work with so many athletes at Ohio State, I assume you played a lot of sports as a kid?
Yeah, I did a little bit. I played some baseball and some tennis and a little bit of soccer, so dabbled a bit.
So, although you were a bit of a jock growing up, also here you were a nerd as well.
I'd say more nerd, less jock. My kids would definitely attest to that. Yeah, so I just enjoyed playing sports. I super enjoyed watching sports. I was hooked into baseball, watching baseball growing up. I was obsessed with baseball cards and statistics, and Baseball Tonight was on my TV all night long, and I had the baseball encyclopedia. I loved everything about stats way back then, so yeah, heavy on the nerd side.
So yeah, Ken and I got to see some of your statistical prowess earlier this morning as you pulled a name out of the history books of NFL running backs.
Yeah.
So that was pretty impressive.
All great information that comes in handy, usually never.
So I understand you had a high school chemistry teacher that played a big role in you getting excited about science. You want to tell us about that?
Yeah, I did. Thinking back on how I had kind of made my journey into academics, it was really that Mr. Proctor was his name. So I always liked math and, the science side of things. But it was really like getting into the chemistry lab, and he just had a great personality and really outgoing and great professor, and just everything stuck. And I think it was also just making things in like chemistry lab. You got to make things and set things on fire. And we made rum one time. He told us we could drink it if we dared, but like looking at the glassware, it's like, no, we're not. I do not know what I just made. But yeah, that was really kind of pivotal point of academics, is I knew I liked math and I loved chemistry. So I was like, well, I guess I'll be a chemical engineer. That sounds like the right thing to do. And I got in my first semester and it was so freaking hard. I was like, oh, I'm not turning back now. So I'm just going to do this and see what happens. And
yeah, it's always amazing the influence a single individual like that can have in your path.
Yeah, plus or minus.
Yeah, plus or minus, no doubt.
Yeah, I had a truly dreadful high school chemistry professor, and there was no joy. There was no making things.
Is this why you're a computer scientist?
Yeah, this was just balancing these ridiculous equations, the chemical balancing, and very, very dry, and no real motivation. So that I do appreciate how it could go one way or the other.
Absolutely, yeah.
So tell us, how did it lead to you going to the University of Cincinnati?
It was a very natural fit for me. So I knew I wanted to stay around Ohio, and I visited a couple different places and visited Ohio State. I think at the time they were redoing one engineering building and like wires were everywhere, and it just didn't look, and that was my impression, and like good or bad. But then UC was just really well known for their engineering school, and their co-op program was a pretty big deal for me because it gave you a chance. And that was really pivotal too, because it was not just straight school for 4 years, but you actually, after your first year, you're going and working in a job, and like, it's nice to get a break and you actually make some decent money, but see what the job is. And then you can go back, and then every quarter, every semester, you're doing that. So it gives you this natural ebb and flow. Like you just get absolutely demolished for a quarter academically, but then you get to go work and, see what this can really be. And then a lot of times those co-op jobs lead to your full-time jobs because they want to hire you out of there. So it's just natural fit. And I had some friends going there as well. So it was just comfortable, good program, and still, I did my graduate work there as well. So it was just felt like home for me.
That's a good segue into the next part, because after you earned your bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, and then you went to work for a company, but after a while decided that chemical engineering really isn't what you wanted to do for a living. So you sought out a professor you really liked at Cincinnati to get some advice. What did he tell you?
Yeah, it was, it all led me to my graduate work in Wright-Patterson, but it was the same thing, like, you grind after 4 or 5 years of college, super hard. You just want a job. I wanted to make money. I wanted a job and just kind of do that. And then I'm 6 months into the job and I'm just pretty bored to tears. And then I was actually watching a, more senior engineer doing the same things that I was doing. He'd been doing it for 20 years. And I was just like, man, I don't think I want to do this for 20 years. I mean, it was comfortable, but, and then I had this really great, funny British professor, Steve Clarkson. He taught polymer chemistry. He was just an elective that I took.
Steve,
just very entertaining guy, super entertaining. And I just knew that he always had graduate students that worked at Wright-Patterson. And I just had this feeling that I wanted to do some military research. Like I don't know, it was something about it that I love the idea of, especially the Air Force and, military and, what can I do to help? And it was also just like super cool. Like, can you do advanced research for the DoD? And I knew that he always had a grad student. So I left work one day early on a Friday and I just drove down. I went into his office and I said, I want to get my PhD and I want to do it at Wright-Pat. And he just on the spot, he was like, okay, come on, let's start. Didn't know anything about my grades or anything. And luckily that all panned out. And that's kind of the way he is too, is like, and then he just threw me right into the fire. The very first meeting I had, he was like, okay, you're going up to the base and you're going to present this data. I had no idea what it was. I was a week into grad school, had no idea what it was. And then he sends an email to everybody on the team saying like, we've got this amazing data to show you today. And he can't make it, but I'm sitting there like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm doing. But luckily we had this great team there, and Jim Grody was there, and he was, he kind of understood the situation and kind of brought me in, and that's how it went from there.
Then it was at the Materials Directorate at the Air Force Research Lab where you first met Morley. What do you remember, Morley, about the young Josh?
Well, I remember, I don't know if this is the project you were doing with Steve, but I remember a project you were working on with exploring DNA as a biomaterial. And I think for our listeners, usually when you're working with DNA, you're working with, picogram, nanogram amounts of DNA. And in this case, this was a project really treating it like a bulk material. And then if you were to treat it like a bulk material, not only was that cool enough as a concept in and of itself, but then Josh's work was really looking at putting it into devices, real working devices like LEDs. And so first of all, I just thought the topic itself was a great topic. Looking as a biomaterials researcher myself, I loved the direction that was going. But in particular, what always impressed me about your work, Josh, is how comfortable you were in both the basic and the applied. And your ability to go back and forth between the two, I just thought was exceptional. So that always stuck with me.
Mm.
Yeah, it was a really fun lab. And I remember the work that you were doing in the lab with, I think it was extracting some sort of material out of pit viper snakes for thermal sensing.
Yeah.
And just that, but again, that concept of like, holy cow, this is pretty awesome. And I think you guys were like ordering snakes, and luckily I didn't see that part of it.
That's another story for another time.
I do not enjoy those creatures. But yeah, again, just the concept of what the materials director was getting after was really, really cool. And I've always been tied directly to the applied side. Like, I don't feel like I can work on something if I don't know exactly what it's going to end up being or know that it's got some sort of use. So that's what was really neat about it. I certainly didn't know what I was getting into, but it was biomaterials for advanced functionality and organic electronics. That was kind of the basis of it. And with Andrew Steckel and Steve Clarkson and Jim Grody and yourself and Rajesh, like we did find some pretty interesting things there. It was definitely had an interesting title to it that I got made fun of quite a bit for salmon sperm and optoelectronics. Some of my other friends were like, "You're doing what? That's ridiculous."
But I think it drives home the fun we had. And, at any time that you're in the doing discovery and doing novel work, I think the fun and enjoying who you're doing it with, at least it doesn't get better.
Yeah,
for sure. Well, Josh, any first impressions of Morley that you would like to share?
Intimidation. I just still have that. Just this looming presence in the room of like, oh my gosh, I better be prepared. I better know what I'm doing, because there's always going to be challenging but productive questions that come out of it. So it's good. It makes sure that I'm prepared at all times. If I'm in the room with you, like something's going to come at me that I'm not ready for, I'm going to have a great answer like 2 days from now for it. But it's just it was just knowing the research that he was leading, and then the move to the wing. And it's just been a very easy thing for me to know that like whenever we work together, there's a topic I know it's headed in a direction that I don't ever have to question. Like I'm going to be aligned with it philosophically. It's going to be great on a scientific level. So that just makes it easy. Like trying to figure out what you're going to work on or who you're going to work with. Like if you can have people like that, you can just cut through all of that and just like there's no questions, just let's go and let's figure it out.
Agreed. After you completed your graduate work at Cincinnati, you once again went to work for a company in the private sector. And for the second time, you realized that you had perhaps made a mistake. I understand that you then went, and these are your words, crawling to Morley to ask him for a job. Is that essentially correct?
Yeah. I walked, but it was philosophically a crawl. Yes, I kind of did the same thing again, where I grinded out a PhD, and it was great. It was like, everybody who's done it, you're not making a lot of money. It's the job. I was like, man, so I got an offer in industry at a company in Cincinnati. It was, a great company, way different than what I was doing before. And then just sitting there where the same thing happened again. I'm a couple years into it and I'm just like, what am I doing? Like, it was great. Like, treated me great. It was, from a human perspective, it was good. And I do have to say not all bad came out of it because I met my wife there.
Oh.
So that was the reason I should have been there. Is
good save.
That happened. Yep. So I got my wife and 2 kids out of that job. So that did what it needed to do. But same thing. I was just sitting there and I didn't have passion for what I was doing. Like, again, it was a good job and I was treated very well and it was comfortable, but I didn't truly believe in the mission. And it was the same thing. I just looking there and realized like, man, back to this DoD research and doing really good things that I could be passionate about and really believe in. And then just started sending some notes of like, I want to come back. I want to do something full-time back at Wright Pat, and was lucky enough that Morley was in a position to, had openings and had things going on, and same thing. So just took that step forward and took a bit of a leap because it was a big career change at the time, but it was exactly what needed to happen.
In 2018, you left the Air Force and went into academia at West Virginia University, where you became the director of the Human Performance Innovation Center at the Rockefeller Neuroscience Institute. First, how did you come about that, and can you give us an overview of the work that went on at the Institute?
Yeah, I got really lucky, and everything's kind of happened, I think, for the right reason. I spent, all in all, about a decade in the DoD doing DoD research, and still love it, still embedded there, believe everything about it. But I kind of viewed it as a bit of a sabbatical, so try something different, get a different perspective on it. Because before I was working with academics, but not in academics. So I just got very fortunate with an opportunity with Dr. Ali Rezai. I knew him from some work at Ohio State, and he got the position at West Virginia to build up the big institute there. And so he gave me the opportunity to build up some human performance research. And it was just really good to see that lens from academia and how different it is. Very good things about it are, almost complete freedom to work on the projects and the ideas that we want to work on. did have a lot of freedom in the DoD, and we push those bounds quite a bit, but you're also like answering to somebody, and you've got some path, and you've got to fit the narrative and do certain things. So it's just I struggle with sometimes if I see something that really should be done and needs to be done, and I've got a customer. In my case, it could be a special operator, it could be a commander saying, I need this thing. And if somebody tells me I can't work on that thing when I think it's the right thing to do, that's where it was really intriguing about academia, is the ability to listen to demands from our customers and actually try to get after the things that they want to get after. So got very lucky. I spent about 3 years at West Virginia, was able to build up a really impressive laboratory. It was a good situation where it was a building that we got to retrofit and had a good amount of funding to like build up a pretty amazing human performance lab that's, still operating. They're still doing great work, a little bit more on the clinical side. Mm-hmm. But yeah, it was just a good perspective to have a few years from that to build something from the ground up and let it take off, and then move to other things after that.
After a few years at West Virginia, Morley once again stepped into your life and offered you a job at Ohio State University. Morley, at the time, was the senior vice president for research at Ohio State. From what I've heard, this job turned out to be a really great fit for you.
Yeah, it was, again, like all of these steps seemed like they were supposed to happen. I certainly could have done it more efficiently, but I think it needed to happen in that way. So it allowed me to really understand the academic beast and just the way that it operates, financially and politically and all of that. I had no idea how any of that works. So I got to understand a lot of that from the academic side at West Virginia. But I am I've got Buckeyes in my blood. I, grew up 30 minutes south of campus. Like it is, if you walk into Chillicothe, Ohio, you think it is campus, like just rabid Buckeye fans there. So like we live and die by all things Buckeyes, especially Buckeye football. So the opportunity to, again, like be able to follow Morley, to where he was at. And again, just that trust of like, I know that research is headed in the right direction and there's a good vision to it. But the ability to, work directly with Ohio State, it's a fantastic research organization. Take the learnings that I had from working at West Virginia and really how do we build up less of a brick and mortar, but how do we actually build up hopefully a monster of a human performance research department at the university, and being able to try to break down some of these academic silos and just really partner and team. And there's just so many brilliant people there and brilliant graduate students and so many opportunities. It's just trying to capitalize on all of those things. So it's been a fantastic opportunity.
In your role as director of the Human Performance Collaborative, you work with a multidisciplinary team of engineers, researchers, sports scientists, data scientists, and others in the pursuit of optimizing human performance. In addition to working with athletes at Ohio State, you also collaborate with the Department of Defense to investigate ways to augment human performance within the military. Can you give listeners a sense of how your lab works with both groups?
Yeah, it's incredibly fun, and it's like it does require this multidisciplinary nature, because what we're trying to do is maximize human performance for all humans. That sounds like a ridiculous broad objective, but that is really what we're trying to do. Like every single one of us can be optimized to some level. I can be optimized probably 80 or 90%. An elite operator and elite athlete, like they're looking for that 5% advantage. So it's really dialing into each one of those and understanding the challenges and the opportunities. But that's why it takes that multidisciplinary nature of exercise physiologists, data scientists, biochemists, psychologists, and all of those experts are at the university. So it's really trying to pull it all the way back to understand the needs of that population. What are their challenges? What are they trying to do? If it's Ohio State football, you're trying to perform on a Saturday. Like that is the objective. And obviously there's lots of other things intertwined with that, injuries and availability and all of those different things. And so that's in kind of the modeling world. Like that's a pretty simple, very complex, but like a simple problem. Like we want to perform on this day. Whereas what's interesting in the military domain is we have to perform every day. Sometimes consequences are higher and we have to get ready for things, but it's how do we perform every day? How do we stay healthy every day? How do we increase the career lifespan? How do we increase quality of life? So these things get a lot more complicated and a lot more complex, but at the baseline of it is we're still applying the same methodologies. We're trying to understand what is allostatic load. Everybody's got this load placed upon their bodies. How do we quantify that? And then how do we do something about it? And we have to have both of those sides, but I'm super fascinated by both of those, especially on the what do we do about it? Because it's not just stress is what it is and you're going to deal with it. Like there are pretty amazing cutting edge tools that we can apply to once we understand, but it's also what do we need to recover from? Sometimes, or a lot of times, stress is good. We do want times where we want the body to endure that stress and adapt to that stress, but other times we need to perform consistently. We need to be able to understand and recover from that consistently. So it's just been very fun to take all of that expertise together and have those conversations, but it also takes very specific people to have those conversations and people that can understand in athletics and in the DoD, the fast-paced nature of where things happen. And this is not a basic research world. This is not something to where 5 years from now I'll give you an answer. It's got to, like, some of that will come. It's got to be, what can we do for you today? Let's really understand if policies are the issue. If, we had some great conversations with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office and just understanding their challenges, and that's, physical fitness and nutrition and all those different things, but just understanding, okay, these are the pillars that we need to help improve. Now, how are we going to do those things?
A lot of what you're touching on is just how multifaceted are all the areas that you have to bring together. We've touched on advanced data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence. In many ways, your job is to bring those together to help drive human performance. Now, when you talk about this, I've heard you stress the need to understand performance at a system level. Can you explain what you mean by that for our listeners?
Yeah, we define performance as broadly as we can, and that is very specific to every environment. But I think the connotation of human performance and high performance is just Olympic athletes and the most elite from the physical style, but every single one of us can perform better. So how do we define performance, and what is that metric? And that metric is defined differently by different stakeholders. So myself, I have a level that I want to perform, but then the people that I work for have different things that they're looking for. And this is a lot easier to kind of see on maybe the military and athletic side, where, you have a commander where they're probably most interested in readiness and, how ready are you from all of the different domains, from a physical domain, from an injury domain, a mental domain, a spiritual domain. Like, are you ready to go from that perspective? But then your strength coach has different things they're looking for as far as performance. And then your mission commander has different things they're looking for. So it's really understanding all of those different things, and how do we move the needle on all of those, and how do we understand what is that return on investment from a training and recovery perspective to get performance. And performance is just a very hard thing to measure, especially in the military. It's like, I don't want to say it's impossible, but it's extremely difficult. And that's why we use a lot of our work in sports science to try to model those things, because these are extremely physically stressed and mental stress. I think we kind of undervalue the mental stress that athletes are under. College athletes are, there's academic stressors, there's emotional stressors, there's other outside the field stressors. They're also learning a massive amount of information just from a tactical perspective. So they have those demands. Obviously, the consequences of poor performance is much different from sports to military, but at least we know when games are, and we have like some objective performance measures for games. But as simple as that model sounds, it's still difficult. So even just, how do I quantify performance of an Ohio State football athlete? I still don't have a score that I can truly trust. There's things like Pro Football Focus and, all of these different applications, but you now have this somewhat objective scorer of every position, every player, every play, every game is scored by some third-party person. But then how much can you trust that score? Like, our position coaches may not trust that because they don't know the context behind that. So maybe this receiver got a poor score in blocking, which was probably true on film, but that wasn't what he was supposed to be doing. Like, he was tactically doing what he was supposed to do. So we're trying to put a lot of effort into, like, how do we quantify performance, which is important to us, because then we can take the machine learning approaches and take all of this input of data, and can we actually perform what that score was on that day, and then understand what led into good performances, what led into poor performances. So it's very challenging, but very intriguing.
Josh, some years back, maybe 4 or 5 years back, Ohio State's wrestling team was well known for extensive use of heart rate variability monitoring, and they felt that it strongly correlated with performance, particularly in some of the athletes. Were you aware of any of that?
Yeah, we were part of some of that, and wrestling is a great sport to quantify from a sports science perspective, because the training, as you guys know, is incredibly intense and very quantified. And things like, I do enjoy, like, they've got watt bikes that they use all the time. So now here's a number that I can understand output, and they get after it. Like, they train so hard. And now if we can combine heart rate data with that watt bike, but then heart rate variability is still a very well-used tool from our perspective of understanding that autonomic nervous system status. We like to look at it before the training starts, after the training. I think what's neat about where the commercial technologies are now, like, we're gathering that data during sleep. So I think it's very effective, but it's a broad brush still. And I think we have a lot to do with the tools, because stress is stress. And I don't know that, your heart rate variability measure was based just because of that physical taxing that you just put your body through, or is it because of all these, like, these emotional and other things that are happening too? So that's very confounding, but we do use that quite a bit to trigger some of our recovery protocols, and just understanding, but again, just knowing that it's not going to tell us the entire story, but we start looking at it from again, nocturnally, from, if your heart rate variability is trending a certain direction over multiple days, that's when we can set up alerts and triggers so the strength coach, athletic trainer can see that, talk to the athlete and say like, okay, what's going on? Like what's attributing to this? And then what can we do about it?
Right. I heard a case where a very talented wrestler suddenly was performing poorly, and it had to do not with physical stress, but it had to do with problems at home and conflict with a family member. And this was tearing him up, and it affected his outlook and his performance and his confidence.
Yeah. I think one of the pivotal things that happened, this was way back when we started with Ohio State football, and we were doing heart rate variability measurements, and it was pretty early into it. And again, I was just providing some kind of flagging and some, I'm an outside perspective, like I'm not with the athlete. So my job is to distill that data into something actionable for a strength coach. Like they're the ones that are with the athletes all day, every day. And we saw one athlete that had some scores that were, from my perspective, they were just much lower than that athlete's norm. And I just alert the strength coach. And what's so important about that relationship is they build this amazing trust between the coaches and the athletes. Like that is, especially with strength coaches, like there's no difference or there's nothing like that. So they had a conversation with this athlete, and it turned out to your point, they were extremely nervous. Like it was actually going to be, they were a very young athlete. It was the first time they were going to start in a game because of some injuries. And, he was just being quiet and wasn't talking to anybody. Like physically, everything looked fine, but it was just that mental nerve. But then the ability to, again, what we're trying to do with this data is improve conversation and just bring that up and have that conversation. And then they're able to help that athlete and figure out like, okay, let's just talk. So it said like, might just see somebody being quiet. Hey, everything's probably fine, but maybe it's not. And how can we talk you through this and get you to perform?
So I think to help our listeners better understand some of the directions that you take this work, we're going to link to a YouTube video that illustrates some of the work you and your colleagues do with athletes. In the video, you talk about using training load monitors. How do they work, and how can you use them to get some more insight into an athlete?
Yeah, so which is nice. This is kind of sports science 101 these days, which means that the technologies have evolved to a place where this is now existing at most places. But it's fundamentally training load. And again, we're trying to get after capturing this concept of allostatic load, but training load is, from a physical perspective, is pretty much the most straightforward. So we have we're blessed with a lot of great commercial tools. So we bent it into internal load and external load technology. So internal load is primarily heart rate measures. External load is going to be your mechanical movement, your distances, accelerations, cuts, and things like that. And in an ideal setting, we get both. So you can understand what is that external mechanical work that athlete is doing. But I also want to know, because if you just have that, you don't know how hard their body had to work to create that mechanical force. But it is very important in things like speed development, especially for some of our skill positions and sports that require a lot of agility and a lot of speed, and being able to now quantify and even just know, like, one of the baseline things that we usually do is just what our game demands. And so we have these sensors on during games. So we actually know what the training load demand is for a wide receiver for Ohio State football. And it's almost public information for everybody now. You can now mine this data for the NFL and other places. So now you can kind of know this is generally what the demands are for this position. And then you can pull that back and train to that and understand. We even dial that into practices of, okay, we know game requires this many accelerations, this many high speed yards. So now the strength coaches can take that and say like, okay, we want to hit this number of yards this day. And we can quantify, like, did we actually hit those things? And if yes, great. If no, then how does that affect our training plan the next day? I've seen this done incredibly well with the U.S. men's national soccer team, where soccer in general uses this data incredibly well. They know it incredibly well, but they even have models, some of these different teams where they can, just plug in like, hey, this was or they know all the training load coming up to it. This is our projected training load for tomorrow. Like, how is that going to fit within our numbers and our models? And then talk to the coaching staff about that, because coaching staff has their plan, and that's a negotiation with them of like, they have to do things on the field, but your strength staff, your athletic training staff is responsible for keeping these athletes healthy. So having that kind of negotiation of like, okay, we know you have to achieve this. This is kind of what our numbers are saying, what we need to do for our athletes. Like, how do we find a middle ground, and how do we keep both sides happy?
Given this incredible body of work that you've been able to assemble across a variety of different sports, what's the biggest change that you've seen in terms of how you approach the off season? What are some nuggets that have emerged from this body of work that you've done?
I think it's allowed us to still train incredibly hard in the off season, but quantify that progress. And some of these things are nothing new, like strength and conditioning and weightlifting. And there's still things that have developed in the 50s and 60s that are still used. But I think some of the emerging technologies that kind of help in that phase. So if strength coaches have their goals in the off season of, training blocks and what they want to achieve, we can understand if we're achieving those by like basic strength and power measurements, but we have other tools like force plates and velocity-based training where we can now get a lot of data during a workout to really understand that neuromuscular process through every workout through the entire off season. So I think it helps us like really track where that athlete is, and instead of just doing a block and then just doing some pre-testing and post-testing, we now have a lot of data like within those sessions to understand how that athlete's responding, and then you can adjust as well. And a big thing that we've done with the force plates is understanding that, especially lower body biomechanical force development and just understanding the phases of a counter movement jump. And there are ways to actually train to those phases and try to get that performance outcome. But what's important about that too is not every human being should move the same way, right? We all have our different capabilities, especially in sports and in military, where we are going to move differently. So it's trying to understand, is there a signature to optimal movement for that team, for that position, for that year of that position? Because a freshman wide receiver is not going to move the same way as a senior wide receiver. So one of the things we've tried to do is, it's fun having so many elite athletes at Ohio State, is you can actually model, and we went through this, we actually, 10 years of data of, we've got we got Heisman Trophy winners and all Big Ten winners and NFL draft picks. And like we actually went through and mined what round they were drafted in. And now we have data kind of back up of like, this is what a premier NFL linebacker from Ohio State looks like. Like what was their signature, their senior year, junior, sophomore, freshman year. And then can you kind of see if you're on that trajectory and how do you train to some of those different things? And same thing in the DoD. We've been trying to do this with units for a long time, but that's a way harder one, is to like, is there, even for a certain MOS for a certain service, like not everybody's going to perform the same, because if you've seen some of these people, like you just have this, you watch a movie and you think that they're all built the same, but they're absolutely not. Like you'll see some amazingly unassuming looking people that are just amazing physical specimens. So I think it's just figuring out for that capability and that mission set, and this is back to that needs analysis, like what are the energy demands, what are the strength demands, what are the power demands to achieve that? And then do we have measurable ways to understand, can we train somebody up to performing that standard?
We are conducting this interview in April, which is the start of the baseball season. You were part of a longitudinal study that looked at changes in maximal strength as a result of resistance training and its impact in terms of total home runs per game across 3 years of training and competitive seasons for 4 NCAA Division I baseball teams. Can you talk about this study and how you and your colleagues went about enhancing the resistance training of the baseball players?
Yeah, I think baseball is a pretty fascinating sport when it comes to math and statistics. Like I've had the privilege of talking to a couple of teams in the last maybe 6 months again, we're just trying to understand the landscape of sports science. And I think in general, like, European soccer has been bought in for an extremely long time. But as far as American sports, I think baseball has gone headfirst into statistics. Like I've been floored by the amount of staffing and infrastructure that these teams have, even like mid-market teams that are just all like dozens and dozens of sports scientists and biomechanists. And I was shocked to learn that every single major league stadium has high-speed cameras installed in the stadium. Every swing, every pitch is biomechanically analyzed in every single game. So that's why we're interested in that study of, again, from the performance perspective is, baseball has, a lot of really good statistics that we can, I think, pretty reliably quantify performance. Get back to what we talked about earlier is, if we have a performance measure, do we have some measurables with biomechanical force and overall just strength and power assessments that we can try to correlate to that? So that's what that work was based off of, is we can we, again, try to understand that, what that profile might look like, and then how do we train to it?
This might be a good time to dive into the research and studies you and your colleagues are conducting regarding wearables and other technologies related to enhancing human performance. Since we were just talking about athletes, you had a paper back in 2020 that looked at the validity of utilizing commercially available heart rate devices to derive an estimate of core body temperature in Division I NCAA football players. In this study, you were looking for a viable tool to monitor heat stress in football players. It seems obvious why it's important, but can you talk about what this study revealed and its significance?
Yes, this was a really nice full circle study. I would say this work originated out of where we very first began in 2014, 2015 at AFRL. Was we were performing a study in a certain training pipeline, and we were just capturing additional it was a biomarker study, a blood-based biomarker study, but we needed some context for physiological load. So we incorporated the Zephyr physiological monitoring device, which has it is a a highly precise heart rate monitoring tool. It's got some external load in as well. But they incorporated the estimated core temperature algorithm that that Bowler created at Usarium. Still very much used to this day, and it's really how can you use real-time heart rate information to get an estimate for what your core temp is, because there's only one way to get to core temp, and it's not pleasant, and it's not wearable by any means. But this is huge, especially in the military. Like, there's heat injuries, like training is hard, it's hot, it's always going to be that way. These are always going to happen. So what are tools that we can use to potentially prevent these? So we discovered that in the field testing, but then I've had an amazing relationship with the University of Cincinnati Athletics and Bob Mangine and Aaron Himmler there. Still to this day, chat with those guys all the time. They're both athletic trainers. They are passionate about athlete safety, and especially with heat injuries. Like, I've never seen anybody take it as seriously as they do. Like, they do blood draws all the time. They do everything that they can find to keep these athletes safe. Like, I've lived in those, like, summer camp in August in Ohio, and it's worse other places, but they train so hard, and it is like there can be some very severe medical consequences to that. So this was just an amazing opportunity where this wasn't my idea by any means. I found out about it when they were actually doing it because I was just out at camp. I was like, well, what are you guys doing? They asked me a question like earlier, like, hey, is there a pill that we can swallow and get core temp? And I was like, yeah, this one. They got an IRB. They just did it. And I saw it happen. But that was the idea, is they wanted to understand how accurate was this estimated core temperature. And the algorithm was developed, by Usarium, and then reading Bowler's study, a great study, but it was based off of Army soldiers with a certain body type. So we were just then want to understand, like, does this translate to football players? Because if it does, this could be pretty game changing. So they got football players to swallow these core temp pills. And then there was a reader that within breaks of the practices, they could have somebody go out and actually ping it and get the readers and come back. And then we extracted all of that heart rate data, looked at the estimated core temp. What we found is that it was accurate for certain body types within about 1 degree Fahrenheit at all times, which is huge because that's what we want to know. Like, if it's 103 and up, that's when they're going to intervene and do something about it. So that was pretty critical. But what we also discovered was it was a bit body type dependent. But reading back to Bowler's, because we actually backed out the body composition of the athletes, and it was slightly more accurate for lower body comp individuals than higher. But the population it was developed on was lower body comp. So that kind of gave us an idea, like we can definitely expand these. But yeah, I thought that was just a really cool application of, like, again, a forward-thinking university doing great things, and it was just, they just decided to do it, got an IRB, and then we were lucky enough to say, like, hey, we need to analyze that and write it up, and I think it's pretty important information.
Absolutely. One hears all the time about football players in particular succumbing to heat and heat stroke. I mean, it happens every summer, and particularly in this area and in the South where it's incredibly hot.
STEM Talk is an educational service of the Florida Institute for Human and Machine Cognition, a not-for-profit research organization investigating a broad range of topics aimed at understanding and extending human cognition, locomotion, health span, resilience, and performance.
In 2020, you also had a paper on monitoring neuromuscular performance in military personnel. There's a very high standard that elite tactical forces have to meet in terms of physical readiness. Can you talk about how you conducted this study and the significance and importance of closely monitoring neuromuscular performance in this community?
Yeah. So all credit on this one. I've got amazing PhD researchers in my group, Justin Merrigan and Jason Stone. They're absolute beasts in the world of lots of things, exercise physiology, but especially biomechanical force development, and especially Justin, who did his PhD in biomechanics and high performance. But what we are very interested in as a group is, like, one of the things that's rising up in the commercial side is force plates. And obviously force plates have been around for a very long time. What these companies are now doing is they're making data acquisition very easy. So you can take force plates that are, 1,000 hertz resolution, but it can, even these days, we have one system that, Bluetooth to a tablet and instantly analyzes that force time curve, gives you your scores. You can compare it against your last score. You can compare it against your position group. Like, this all happens in 5 to 10 seconds, which is a pretty game changer. But now the flip side of that is everybody's doing it. Everybody's getting data and information. This is another paralysis by analysis where some of these technologies, one single counter movement jump, or say you do a set of 3 and do averages, whatever, but even that session summary, this is not raw data, but that session summary can result in over 200 metrics for that counter movement jump. So now we're blinding strength coaches and athletic trainers and head coaches with, it's almost like, oh, I don't even know what to look at, so we're not going to look at it. Or they just take you do get a jump height, but that's one of the least interesting metrics out of the force plate. So that's what they can relate to because they know they're doing their vertical jumps. So it's an entry point. But what we want to do with these papers is we had a couple of different papers that came out. One of them was just talking about the applications of force production measurements in the military and the tactical population. How can you apply it? And again, having an intent to that, like just having it and having people jump randomly is not going to give you any useful information. It's probably going to give you wrong information because you have no context to it. But we wanted to map out like, okay, the 2 big applications for it. First is neuromuscular fatigue. So if you do repeated measurements every week, every 2 weeks, you can see, and we do this like throughout the football season is a good example of just understanding that week to week, but we do it consistently like the same day every week because we know the training load going into, because if you change days, change time of days, do it after workout, that's all garbage. It's not going to work. So we wanted to map out, here's your methodology for doing it for neuromuscular fatigue. The other side of that is profile monitoring. So if you, back to the off-season conversation is we want to know, or if it's a training phase in the military, you want to have a good clean measurement at the beginning of that training phase, and you want to have a clean measurement at the end of it to see how you changed. And those are different measures. It's the same jump and the same movement, but different intents. We did this in football where, we did a profile measurement and we had the coaches juiced up for it. Like it's also, you have to give maximal effort because if they dog it, you're going to get crappy data and you may not know it. So we've got the athletes hyped up and said, this is testing day. Here's your leaderboard. And one of the reasons we picked the technology we did is they had instant leaderboard access, big screen, everybody's way into it. Like, let's go, let's dominate. And the numbers were through the roof. So just making sure, again, that intent of that profiling, we've got that energy and then this is the intent behind it. But then like during the season, it's like, okay, this is for fatigue. Let's make sure we are still giving consistent maximal effort. So it went through these different ways that you can use it. You can, the other big application is return to duty, return to play. So we've got a couple military units that are doing this all of the time. So now if you can get a good, clean profile assessment when you're healthy, if an injury happens to happen, then you can retest them. And you can see during the rehab process, and there's one amazing group down at Camp Lejeune at School of Infantry East that has kind of set their standard of, I think it's maybe 85 or 90% back to your profile jump is one of the assessments that they've got in the return to duty. So that is like an absolute application to, we can use this today. This is how we understand it. But then the other important papers that Justin and Jason worked on in our group was the principal component analysis, because again, that paralysis of 200 plus metrics, what do we even begin to look at? And we need to have things, there needs to be a conversation, like mathematically, we need to figure out through a PCA, but then there have to be conversations of what's meaningful, because there can be mathematically important signatures, but if they have no meaning to a strength coach or an athletic trainer, we have no idea how to change it. So they did some great work in that PCA, but then also like in describing the dimensions of things that we can actually alter from a training perspective. And now we have amazing visuals and Power BI and other systems that pretty instantly after that jump happens, they can have a report of all of their athletes and say, this is where they're at today. This is where they were at last time. And then here's the kind of training domain that they could potentially benefit from to get those numbers back in the right direction.
Josh, I suspect our listeners will be particularly interested in a paper you did on popular commercial off-the-shelf wearables. The ones that allow people to monitor their health and aspects of their health. These are really popular now, wearables like rings and smartwatches. This has grown into a $27 billion industry, and it's growing all the time. However, it's widely noted that there is a lack of independent verification of the accuracy of these devices. Can you talk about this study and what you learned?
Yeah, these are continually going on. We had a couple that came out in 2020, but we continue to do these. So we'll have a couple more. We've had 2 this year so far. We'll probably have a couple more. I don't see that ever stopping. I think the good thing in the commercial sector is that you mentioned 27. I didn't know it was up to 27 billion now. I knew it was in the B's. That's great that that's happening. But what we had to make the approach of several years ago is, okay, we don't need to design the next wearable consumer sensor. We need to know how accurate these things are. And these are probably, like from a scientific perspective and like a Nature and Science Journal perspective, the least interesting to them, but this is probably the most asked for thing that we do is, again, independent. So I view us as the consumer reports of all things consumer wearable technologies. And that's why we very deliberately have no affiliations on a financial side or accept funding from these wearable companies because we want to stay completely independent in that landscape. And so that's where the ones that we published were sleep and a heart rate variability one, and we just published one this year that Justin authored, and heart rate as well. And I think in all of these things, like we have definitely some flags to plant for those. This is another one of those things where, sometimes in science you don't want other people like doing the same thing, or you don't want to do what they did. You don't want them doing the same thing you did. But this is not in this perspective. Like I love it when other labs do the exact same study and we see the same findings. And that's what we're seeing, especially with Naval Health Research Labs that does a lot of this. On the sleep side, I think we can definitively say, or at least I'll definitively say based on our data and what we've published, is that these sleep trackers are getting better every year. I think now almost all of them are outperforming what we used to believe was like the accepted outside of the sleep lab, which is a actigraph. That's what we've used for a long time. They're very hard to use, very hard to process, but they were used in pretty much every study that's done to measure sleep outside of a sleep lab. They're now almost all outperforming that from a sleep, wake, and sleep efficiency perspective. So I feel good about that. What they still all struggle with is sleep staging. And still to this day, you have to have a brainwave signal to be able to get that accurate staging. But again, what we're trying to do is just make sure everybody's aware. First, I want to make sure everybody's aware that error bars exist, because it's frustrating in some of these papers that use wearables that just are acting like there's no error and like this is definitive and like I can read that graph and like that's within the error of that device. So even though you're said statistically I reduce this physiological signal, that we can't say that because I know that error bar. So we just want to report the news on that. So just make sure that you know the accuracy of those things. So really, and the other one that's big is on the heart rate side is obviously we all know like pretty much every watch now glows on the backside. That's giving a heart rate on the wrist. Pretty much across the board, you've got 10 to 20% error in heart rate during exercise for those. And we now have thousands of exercise sessions that we do at Air Force Research Labs and other places as well. But again, it's your purpose. And that's what we want to make sure everybody understands is this is the error bar, but then also what's your intent behind this information. If your intent is to motivate and get somebody to care about their sleep and sleep more, exercise more, just understand about what the intensity of that session was, a lot of these devices are perfectly fine. I will accept more error in a sleep device if it helps you be conscious about what time you go to sleep, what time you wake up, and make better changes. But if you want to do precise performance studies and understand interventions, that's where like some of these things, if we're doing an intervention that we hope affects sleep, whenever we can, we'll have a take-home EEG monitor, especially if we want to say anything about sleep phasing. We want to do that. That definitely impacts the scalability of studies and the ability to do that from a financial perspective. But again, if that's the intent, if I want to see if I can improve deep sleep, and it frustrates me to no end when I read papers that say like, hey, we improved deep sleep by doing this intervention. They use a device that we all know that it doesn't do that thing. So that's kind of troublesome. But yeah, so these will continue to go on. But I think those are kind of the definitive statements that we can make today. But again, the pace of these things, like that new hardware, new firmware, new things are coming out, like this just has to keep going. And we have to, luckily enough, like these studies are easy enough to do that there's a lot of them out there. But then also understanding, what application. So it may not be, and we've tried to do this for the DoD of saying like, okay, again, our statement is this on wrist-based heart rate, but there's still the case on some people where it's incredibly accurate. And I'm still not sure why that is. I'm not convinced it has anything to do with skin tone or wrist circumference. We've done some measurements in that. I think some of it just has to do with maybe your physiology and maybe your vein structure. I don't know. Like, I'm not really interested in figuring out why that is, because I think we'd be just chasing our tail forever on that. But what I want to do is arm people with, here's how you can do the study on yourself for $90. Buy a Polar H10, get the free Polar Beat app, and we even made slides for the military. Like, here's step-by-step how you do it. Here's how you take your data, put it into Excel, easy day. So test it on yourself, because it could be very accurate and reliable for yourself. So I don't want to say like throw it away. I want to say here's the way that you can actually test it out yourself. So yeah, again, these will continually go like they're, a lot of the support is coming out of Air Force Research Labs, Strong Lab, and we release this update to the DoD usually twice a year, 3 times a year. The intent of that is it's always to publish papers, but the speed at which papers are produced is not like by the time the paper's produced, the company might be out of business. Definitely there's hardware and firmware upgrades. So we get things out as fast as possible internally and then follow up with papers after that.
In the sleep study, you looked at 9 commercial devices. Did any stand out as particularly effective, or were they all roughly in the same category?
There's definitely a ranking to them. And again, the caveat to this is 2020, and now things are getting better. But I think what we found in our study was Fitbit was one of the top devices. And then I've seen that same thing in the NHRC study. So again, that makes me feel good that we're seeing the same things. And we've seen some of the devices struggle. Garmin's usually lower on that list from those papers, and then some are in the middle. We have seen really good data out of Aura as well on the sleep side and on the physiology side. So I think that's a good thing to mention about the sleep devices too, is, a few years ago, they started incorporating sleep physiology as well. So now we can get pretty reliable resting heart rate or heart rate traces, but that resting heart rate from sleep and heart rate variability from sleep, temperature, respiration rate. Some of them are extremely good at that resting heart rate. Some are not good. Heart rate variability is kind of hit or miss too. Respiration rate is, they all seem to struggle a bit on that one, which obviously is pretty important with COVID. Temperature is an interesting one these days too, because for sure it'll tell you when you have a fever, like it'll show up on these sensors. Like you don't need high precision for that. It's gonna go through the roof, and you're gonna see that. But then again, like that's after you probably already know you have the fever when you see that data. So it's just confirming what you already know. So I'm not sure how interesting.
In general, these sleep devices confirm what you already know.
Yeah.
You say, well, I didn't sleep well, and then the device confirms it.
Yeah.
Particularly with where I've seen like the Oura Ring and things like this be problematic is in deep sleep and REM sleep. In other words, it seems to track REM strictly by movement. There's no EEG. And so people that move when they're in REM, and some people do, they don't show up with any REM. But they're in REM.
Yeah.
So that's potentially confusing. Do you have any advice for the listeners if they were going to be in the market for a sleep device? Is there something that would help them make wise choices?
Yeah, I think, again, it depends on the intent of the user. So if you're, and we do this with some of our work with places like the National Guard and some of our first responders, is we're trying to educate simple things. I'm trying to make sure everybody knows, because if you ask anybody how much sleep they got last night, they're going to do the math of when they got out of bed minus when they went to bed. Getting them to understand, like, that's not how much you actually slept. There's an efficiency metric, and a lot of it has to do with nutrition timing and caffeine and all these different things. And we did a study, it was actually an intervention study of looking at some different modalities. But out of that, we asked questions about, did you consume caffeine 4 hours before bed? Did you have a large meal? Did you consume alcohol? That had nothing to do with the intervention. I was just curious, like, what the relationships are. It's exactly what you would expect. But I thought it was interesting having sleep and sleep physiology devices where with the caffeine, like, so if they had caffeine within 4 hours of going to bed, their sleep duration was affected. Their latency, time to fall asleep was extended. These are things we understand, but their physiological metrics were the same. There wasn't any difference in resting heart rate and heart rate variability. Alcohol was a flip side. So no change in the duration of sleep or efficiency of sleep, but there was a big change in the physiology. Again, these things make sense, but having that data to back it up and presenting that to people and just say, understand that this is the effect of making these decisions on your physiology and how it makes you feel. So if it's, again, that perspective of educating, there's a lot of different devices. If it's for more precision, we use Oura Ring and a bunch of our studies just because we have validated it. It's in our papers, but they also are completely transparent with the data. Like you can get IBI data from a consumer device from Oura Ring.
Yeah,
no
great.
Questions asked. Like that transparency means a lot to me because I can do my own investigation. I can go as deeply as I want to. When you have other companies that say, like, I won't even provide heart rate data to you as a consumer. And again, we're just asking as a consumer. I'm not asking like special favors. This is what they'll do for consumers. I'm not saying that it's wrong, but like that lack of transparency frustrates me because we can't study it. So I think, but again, based on our data, Fitbit's solid, Oura is really good. But again, it depends on your intent of what you're using it for.
Thank you.
You just mentioned another important constituency that we really haven't talked about, and that's the first responder community, because we've focused a lot on athletes and tactical forces so far, but you have done some work with firefighters. They are 3 times more likely to die on the job than any other occupation. Half of firefighter deaths are due to heart attacks, stroke, and heat exhaustion from stress and overexertion. While there's a great deal of attention paid to improving gear and equipment to save lives, not as much attention's been paid to better understanding the physiological and biological processes that firefighters experience and how that understanding might save their lives. Can you talk about this study, which was titled Biomarker and Biometric Indices of Physical Exhaustion in the Firefighting Community?
Yeah, this was an old school one. This is where we started with all of our biomarker monitoring at AFRL, and we just happened to, so Regina Shai and I happened to meet this amazing fire chief on base, Jacob King. Still there, I think. Still grinding it out.
He is, and in fact, we just connected with him not too long ago.
Awesome. It was another one of those things where just like, it's what we're trying to do. And he was like, heck yeah, let's get after it. And I mean, after the IRB was approved, we had his guys in the lab geared up in all of their stuff, IV in their arm, all IRB approved, censored up to the gills. But that was like that was my first study in like trying to understand the biosignature of exhaustion for firefighters. And the intent of that was to help us design sensor systems. So I try to figure out what actually would help us quantify what that physical fatigue was based on sensor devices. So then we don't have to put 20 things on somebody. We can pare it down from there. So me as an engineer, I want all the data all the time, all the things, but then human beings, like you can only put up with so much stuff. So that was the intent with that one. But I think what's really cool is like that has evolved now where we've got this whole line of tactical research on the first responder side that's happening at Ohio State. I actually just successfully got a grant for it last week. We were just kind of doing it because it was a good thing to do, but now we've got funding for it, which is great. But it is really understanding the challenges of both fire and police, and that dynamic is just fascinating because it's similar in some respects to the military where you've got like the different academies and different trainings, but like you generally have to pass some sort of physical test to get in the thing. But then sometimes after that, like there might not ever be a physical test ever again. And so you just see this health decline of it's an extremely stressful job, and especially police, like it's so stressful. You just see bad things all the time. It's shift work. It's poor access to nutrition. So one of the projects that we're doing with them is like, what happens if we actually embed an athletic trainer with your unit? Like if you're actually feeling a twitch or feeling a twinge or something, you can actually just go down the hall and see somebody. This is the POTUF model from SOCOM of accessibility is everything. So this is funding to actually embed an athletic trainer, and we're actually designing a recovery science space for them as well, because recovery is not even in the mix for anybody. And if we can have cold plunges and saunas and Normatex, and we have a new dry float for mental relaxation. So just giving them the access to these things. And we want to study how effectively those things work as well. And the other one to mention is some work we have going on in meditation mindfulness, and that's in healthcare workers now, but it's also going to be in the first responders. And this is, again, they're just the stress that they're under and the things that they see. There's almost no time to recover from a mental perspective. And this isn't, going to see a psych and going for an evaluation. This is giving you tools to cope with these things. And we've seen meditation mindfulness work. It's been proven over and over and over again. But if we give you the tools and give you the applications, and we've got some biofeedback in there as well, which I think has been fascinating out of this project we have with Mariana Klatt with her mindfulness in motion program. Part of it was, and I went through the program, part of her instruction is sleep awareness from a mindfulness perspective. I've been teaching it for decades, but we incorporated an Oura ring with that. We wanted to, from a research perspective, we wanted to understand the physiology and things like that. What was fascinating to me is we got a lot of end user feedback, and just the physically having that ring on their finger made them mindful of sleep. Like we asked them those questions and they said, I look down at it twice a day and I think about breath work. I think about recovery. I think about sleep. I'd never in my dreams that I think that was even a thing until that was the feedback they gave us. So simple things like that of just, again, we're trying to create habit changes. Like we know these things work. How do we give them all the access to all the tools in the toolkit so they can use it and stick with it? Like I don't want some static PowerPoint I'm going to print out for you why you should sleep better. Like we've got to have some sort of habit forming tool or technology to hand them.
Yeah, and I know here at IHMC, this is one of the communities that we're doing a lot of thinking about how can we bring our science base to actually help them with these very real problems that really exist across the country. So perhaps one of the most interesting projects that you have going on is with the Air Force's 711th Human Performance Wing. As most listeners can imagine, military training and elite warfighters requires focused mental and physical capabilities that are akin to that of professional athletes. But with warfighters and special operators, the playing field's the battlefield, as we've talked before. So optimizing the training and nutritional needs of warfighters is obviously a top priority. A program that you've been heavily involved with for the past decade is called STRONG, or Signature Tracking or Optimized Nutrition and Training. Nice acronym work there, Josh.
Thank you.
In this program, you work with the 711th Human Performance Wing in developing physical training regimes and nutritional approaches that can enhance a warfighter's performance and resilience. Can you give us an overview of the program?
Yeah, this was definitely my best acronym work to date. Although we have one in our I won't reveal it now. We have one that might rival it with some of the surgeons we're working with.
Strong is a good one, though.
I got to make sure. Yeah, that's a good one. They give me grief because the G isn't. I kind of faked it on the G, but anyways, it's a great logo, great gear that we can make out of that too. But no, this was a vision that really it was myself and Regina Shai and Adam Strang. Like this is probably like 2016, 2017, maybe a little earlier than that. We had this opportunity with this pretty teched out physiological lab at AFRL that we were lucky enough to get some space for. And it was, how do we turn this into like the monster garage for human performance? And we were very lucky to have some really good work going on in Special Operations Command, and we're able to get support still to this day. SOCOM does a lot of the R&D for the human performance side of there's a lot going on, but a lot of the kind of day-to-day human performance needs. But what we want to do is build up this lab to where the other services and SOCOM could just pick up the phone and say, I've got this question about this thing. Can you help us answer this thing? And what's amazing about what Adam has grown that into, and Jason Eckerly as well, is there's a built-in cohort in the Strong Lab that trains in the lab every day. And it's just a recurring subject pool. It's a, training, strength conditioning training intervention studies are expensive to do. Mm-hmm. But the resources at AFRL and the people that just, PT is part of their jobs, but now they get a custom designed strength conditioning program. They get access to all of the good things. So it really is just our research playground to be able to have continuous data collections year round, highly compliant subjects. We have the ability to do biochemical analysis. We have the ability to do microbiome analysis, a lot of different things that can be pulled out of that. We're now building up a recovery science lab as well. And really, that's one of the next big things is how do we modulate performance through pretty advanced recovery techniques, but understanding it from a physiological perspective and how individualized those signatures are. So yeah, that's a fascinating lab. I'm still embedded in it, privileged to work there every day. But I just love, again, how we can just get after things like it from a very simplistic perspective of if new wearable hits the market tomorrow, however fast I can have it shipped to Dayton, I can have it on somebody and we can start gathering data. Like there's no barriers to that. And we've got to turn information around quickly. Like they've got no patience for it. Like, and just like we're always transparent about it. And I can be like, hey, this is an N of 1. Here's my gut feel about it. If we're thinking thumbs up, thumbs down, then we can design something that's got more subjects and more data to it and dig deeper.
Perhaps can you talk about some of the technologies you've explored in the Strong Lab?
Yeah, so definitely a lot of consumer wearables work that's going on. That's where we got thousands and thousands of workout sessions for optical heart rate on the wrist, on the arm, and we do that versus a chest EKG, the Polar H10. We do a lot of sleep work as well, a lot of different technologies, so force plate technologies. So we do regular testing, sometimes 3 times a week. Some of the different force plate technologies. We've got velocity-based training devices there. We've done some interesting work on a saliva hydration device called the MX3. Again, it was just saliva osmolarity, fundamentally pretty easy to get a measurement. So we'll do like head-to-head of that to urine-specific gravity. We did a big body fat percentage or body composition study. And that one was great because, again, this cohort is great because every 8 to 10 weeks, they recycle and we get more subjects in, and we always do baseline, mid, and post testing. So we've got DEXA scans to get true body composition. And one of our questions is we've got these BIA scales, and we like anywhere from a $60 scale, which we bought one because I was just curious, to a $18,000 version to the like $200,000 DEXA, right? So we're comparing back to that. But we were able to get, just in the routine of how they're doing their testing, it didn't take much extra time at all, is do a DEXA scan. And then in this case, we actually controlled for hydration. And like we did everything based on manufacturing procedures of you can't eat within 3 hours, have to have normal hydration, can't work out, none of which these things are not happening. Like the people that have these things are not controlling for those things. So this is a very controlled, but again, from our perspective is like, we are going to adhere to the instructions that you as a consumer get. Like I'm not going to figure out a better way to do it. I'm going to figure out what you tell us, how you tell us to do it. And we also did like the reliability. So get on the scale 3 times in a row and what does it say? So what we found for those is it was highly reliably inaccurate. So like over and over, it was the same answer, but it was much, much different.
Yeah, the bioimpedance methods often differ greatly from what you get on DEXA. Have you found the more expensive and elaborate bioimpedance systems are closer to DEXA, or are the error bars about the same independent of price?
They're closer based on price, but still, in my mind, not acceptable. Like statistically, still not acceptable.
Right.
And that's even more challenging when ideally, these should be used to look at changes over time. So get a measurement, implement something, and then 8 weeks later, do another measurement. So that makes it even harder to get accurate because now you're looking at maybe a couple % change up or down, and there's no way it's going to have the precision to be able to do that.
And hydration greatly affects the result.
Yeah, absolutely. We looked at that as well. And yeah, USG and saliva. And then we'll also have the ability to look at some, advanced, biochemical sensors as those come through, as they're developed by FRL or other places, and, being able to do a head-to-head against a blood draw and having that same, we can biobank those samples as well and use those later to see if those sensors can replicate the same information.
This might be a good time to segue into a project that we have going on here at IHMC that involves you and Ohio State University, as well as the aforementioned Air Force Research Lab, Strong Lab. This project's called APEX, or Assessing and Augmenting Performance in Extreme Environments. This project aims for real-time assessment of a special operator's cognitive performance during long-duration missions and often in extreme environments. Morley, could you give the listeners a bit of an overview of APEX, as you're one of the principal investigators, and its goal of developing wearable devices as well as an integrated system that will help warfighters overcome fatigue and stress by continually sensing and assessing their performance?
Well, the backstory goes back quite a way, Ken, and it really goes back to something you and I were involved with 10 or 15 years ago when we were trying to adapt the quantified self movement into the DoD and came up with concepts around the quantified warrior, and then in particular, because I was with the Air Force, the quantified airman. But we embodied that concept in this sense, assess, augment paradigm. And at that time, we knew that the trajectory that wearables were on, that this was going to continue to gain momentum. And as we've talked about earlier, now be a $27 billion industry. How do we capitalize upon that tech development, bring that into the DoD environment, and really on the assess piece, do mission relevant assessments of how this tech is giving us insight into warfighter performance? And then the last piece being that augmentation, and it can be everything from some of the sleep studies that Josh just talked about. It could be nutrition, or it could be things like vagal nerve stimulation. So then just understanding how to put that together in a recursive systems engineering loop and do that rinse and repeat. That's really what the program's about. And so I just thought it was important to give that story because in many ways, you, Josh, you've been along with this journey from the start as well. If you remember, it was about 10 or 15 years ago, had that first picture that we made and we pieced together. We actually pasted in a wearable into a flight crew and said to ourselves, imagine if our flight crew had the benefit of actually seeing what their vitals were doing over this long mission performance, and we could do something about it.
Mm. It's neat to see where that started and where it's come and how we are still definitely on that trajectory. And in some ways we've made, I think, amazing progress. In other ways, I feel like we're still there. I think that's probably true with everything else. Mm-hmm. I think the opportunity it affords, and specifically to this program, is, these great the commercial sector has all this going on, and it's, these are consumer devices, but can they perform at these extreme conditions? Like we, in the military population, we're going to be dealing with a lot of different operational settings of high temperature, low temperature, long duration, high sweat, a lot of different applications. So from a materials perspective, from a sensor perspective, baselining all these devices, like, do they perform? Like, A, what are the conditions? Do they perform at these conditions? What duration do they perform under these? When is there complete failure? When is the noise of the signal gone? Like, none of this has been tested in the consumer environment because they aren't exposed to it. So we need to make sure that, can these devices work in that military setting? And if not, there has to be even more innovation on the materials side, on the sensor side, on the processing side to deal with that.
Yes, APEX is a particularly interesting project in that it involves intensive involvement, not just of the Air Force Research Lab and IHMC and Ohio State, but also commercial partners that
absolutely
have products that can be evaluated, as you said, in a realistic and rather strenuous environment.
So that's one of the things I wanted to mention about APEX in particular. To me, there's two unique hallmarks. The first, it's a cooperative research agreement. So our ability to work hand in glove with our former Air Force colleagues is there, and it's something that has been a real joy to be able to extend and leverage as part of our research agenda. And the second thing is, like you were talking about, Ken, the consortium of both industry and academia that we've been able to bring into this cooperative research model. So obviously Josh is there representing Ohio State. We have Georgia Tech as part of it. We have Polar that we've talked about earlier in this podcast. We have Abbott BioWearables, Triple Ring Technologies, electroCore. And so a constellation of companies that allow us to come in and now, in this environment that we've been talking about, a sense, assess, augment, actually bring mature tech into it and see if it can make a difference into, in particular, some of these long duration mission profiles that we're focused on in the program.
Mm. In terms of commercial partners, one company that Josh has worked with a lot is called Smartabase. It's a human performance optimization platform for sports teams, as well as other organizations such as military organizations. And Morley says that you're a black belt when it comes to using the Smartabase platform. So you must really like this program and find it useful. Could you sort of quickly tell the listener what the program is about and why you find it useful?
Yes, I think first and foremost, it's an enabler, and we have to do a lot of work these days. It's not just about sensor development, but it's how do we enable the end users to have, anytime I step into a new place, especially in athletics, when they want to explore some new data or new technology, it's workflow and logistics first. And how do I seamlessly get this information to them? Because if it's cumbersome in any way, shape, or form, it's going to fail. Like, we do not have time to add into the day. So this product in particular, Smartabase, is what the industry calls an athlete management system, or an AMS. There are a handful out there. We started discovering them again back in that 2013, 2014 timeframe. And the need really arose out of all these different technologies that existed commercially. Is now it's very possible, like on our football team, we probably have over half a dozen different technologies that have all sorts of different information. So without some sort of central database for that, they're going to go in their separate bins, and you've got no hope of ever visualizing, let alone analyzing that data. It's the data wrangling that would just take you forever. And again, it's not going to be usable. So as scientists, we could probably go in and get it and write papers, but they need to make decisions on the DoD and athletic side within hours, if not minutes. So these AMSs are they're commercially created so they can, in an ideal scenario, just cloud to cloud, pull that data in via API, which is now very standard in all sports. So really, by the time you end that session, all of your GPS data, all your heart rate data should populate dashboards, within 5 to 10 minutes, and you can log in. We have done a lot of development in this particular platform. It has scaled out to the DoD quite a bit in different services, which has been fun to see. This is now an official program, official, to some degrees, authority to operate, and all these other things that have just taken a mountain of work at AFRL to get to that, and they have really championed this. So now this is a real thing. But really it's data platforms, and it's enabling you to be able to utilize your data instantly. And so there's a couple of different perspectives too, and it's like the world of data visualization is very fun. I think it's more art than science. Obviously there's good science behind it, but it's how do you take a bunch of information and get it to really pop out to where that person can make action of it. And it's interviewing those different stakeholders and figure out what do you need to see, what do you need to act, how would you actually action this data? And then you just step through that process and make sure that it's something that it's usable for them and it pops out. And it's just constant iteration. One of the big things that we did is we set up this kind of alert and flagging procedure, because now, especially in the DoD, you could have thousands of users and you may only have a couple people looking at it. So how do we create these rule-based systems, decision tree systems, ideally in machine learning at some point when we get there? But how do you sort through all of that? And how do you see okay, I've got 1,000 people I got to take care of, but these 10, these are the issues with these 10. And now how do I go to the next level and have a conversation and go deeper in these data? So that's really enabled it. But there's other amazing tools, Power BI and our studio. And, we're agnostic when it comes to anything data viz. We've got multiple things working at Ohio State because it's the right tool for the right job. Some things work better than others in different environments, but the ability to pull up that data too on a mobile device, on a computer. Some people are still old school and they want printouts. We can make dashboards where we print out, hand them a piece of paper, or they can just log into their iPad and look at it. So just that flexibility to get data in and visualize in action.
Yeah, it's hard to overstress how your individual leadership has really helped to enable this across the Department of Defense. So
we use it here.
Yeah, it's remarkable.
It's taken Adam Strang deserves a ton of the credit on that. A lot of people in the DoD too, but just the amount of effort it's taken to, you needed a champion for it. It's a product that works, but to get it to work in the DoD systems, that's a beast. No doubt. I'm glad I didn't have to.
Again, having looked at the beast for some time, I really appreciate what you did to slay that beast in this particular issue. So Josh, I tell you, in all the time I've known you, I have to admit there's just one thing I don't quite understand about you. That's how does someone go from working in a French lab developing spearmint and other flavors to now working with elite athletes and warfighters? Just seems like a pretty big jump.
It's because I knew you. That's the only reason.
Well, it's been a heck of a journey with you, my friend. And any plans to go back into the spearmint business?
No, I chew it regularly. And my wife is masterful in making those things. So I will just enjoy what she makes and I'll keep doing what I do.
All right. Well, Josh, this has been great fun.
Appreciate it, guys. Thanks.
Absolutely. It was a lot of fun and good job, Josh.
Thanks. Sounds great.
STEM Talk. STEM Talk. STEM Talk.
I have to say, Ken, one of the great pleasures of our job is that we get to watch the evolution of young scientists, and I have thoroughly enjoyed watching Josh emerge as one of the top researchers in his field. The work he is doing at Ohio State with the Human Performance Collaborative is truly cutting edge.
Indeed it is, and we are pleased to work with Josh at IHMC in developing and testing wearable devices. Although wearable devices are still in their infancy, their potential to provide real-time assessments of a person's cognitive and physical performance has huge implications for the military as well as for civilian populations.
If you enjoyed this interview as much as Ken and I did, we invite you to visit the STEM Talk webpage, where you can find the show notes for this and other episodes at stemtalk.us. This is Morley Stone signing off for now.
And this is Ken Ford saying goodbye until we meet again on STEM Talk.
Thank you for listening to STEM Talk. We want this podcast to be discovered by others, so please take a minute to go to iTunes to rate the podcast and perhaps even write a review. More information about this and other episodes can be found at our website, stemtalk.us. There, you can also find more information about the guests we interview.